para ser coanfitrión, lo que necesitamos es ingresar donde dice participantes, ahí donde dice más, y ahí debiera aparecer, ¿no?
Sí, correcto.
Porque a mí no me aparece.
Señor, con corbata, no se olvide.
Bueno, por supuesto. Ahora estoy de fajina porque falta todavía media hora.
Sí, pero ya no, o sea, dejamos de hablar por acá porque ya estamos transmitiendo por YouTube.
Perfecto.
¿Ok?
¿Listo?
Ponga en off su video entonces, ponga en off su video. Ya está, ya está. Muy buenas tardes con todas las y todos los participantes. La Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador y ALACDE, asimismo la Universidad Externada de Colombia y la Universidad San Martín de Porres se complacen en organizar esta sesión de ALACDE 2021 que se corresponde al ALACDE número 25. Como ustedes saben, la sesión inicial oficial comienza el día de mañana. Hoy día estamos básicamente desarrollando lo que hemos decidido denominar como mini ALACDE. Bueno, para nosotros es un honor contar con la participación de todos ustedes y su asistencia. Todavía estamos, digamos que muy a tiempo como para que se comience la sesión, así que les vamos a pedir paciencia hasta que la profesora se nos una, ¿ok? El día de hoy, el profesor Juan Martín Morando de la Universidad Argentina de la Empresa va a quedar a cargo. Yo voy a estar simplemente de monitor, ¿ok? Y bueno, de esa forma ensayaremos a partir de mañana para compartir y dividirnos roles con los distintos representantes de las distintas universidades que están apoyando en la organización de este evento aniversario, tanto para la Católica del Ecuador como para la Asociación Latinoamericana e Ibérica de Derecho, de Análisis Económico de Derecho o el Derecho y Economía. ¿Ok? Juan Martín, bueno, te traslado los roles, ¿ok? De coanfitrión y asimismo
Perfecto, perfecto.
voy a hacer con el resto de participantes para que puedan apoyar. Hoy día ha estado un poco inestable Zoom y gracias a Dios tuvimos la oportunidad de poder afrontar ese escenario, pero nunca está de más poder tener todo respaldado. Señor García, como le indicaba, usted está de coanfitrión y bueno, yo me paso a rol de monitor. ¡Éxitos!
Listo, profe, muchas gracias.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, how are you?
Great, thank you. How about you?
I'm all right.
Okay, so I'm going to try to, do you want to present a PowerPoint? Okay, you are co-host. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
thank you. I have a couple of slides I can use. I don't normally use
Wonderful.
many, but I have maybe 2.
Okay, okay, that'll do it. Okay, well, you know, I wore my University of Chicago tie because you were coming, so.
Well, thank you.
Great.
I appreciate that.
Okay, wonderful. We still have 18 minutes, so if you want to, I don't know.
Well, I'm going to test out this slide business because
wonderful,
I'm not
great.
very adept at it. So do you see a slide here?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Wonderful, great.
All right.
So I'll be back in around 10 minutes.
No problem.
Okay, if there is anything you want, just let me know.
Okay, sure, thanks.
Thank you.
It's interesting, okay. This is very strange.
So, Professor Bernstein, can we record this session? Is it okay for you?
Sure.
Okay. Great. Okay, 2 more minutes and we are ready to go.
Okay. Can you see my slide with the categories?
Yeah. Yeah. Looks perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we're switching to English again. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have the privilege to have with us Professor Lisa Bernstein. Professor Lisa Bernstein, she has a BA from University of Chicago, a BA in economics. Sorry about that. She also has a JD from Harvard University. She works now at the University of Chicago as a law professor. She worked at Oxford University, Tilburg University, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Columbia University, Georgetown University, University of Pennsylvania, Boston University, also at Harvard Law School. I mean, you work almost everywhere, right?
I like to travel.
Yeah, I can tell that. Okay, now Professor Bernstein's area of expertise are contracts and commercial law, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for giving this gift to ALACDE. We're really, really proud to have you here. And okay, whenever you want, you can begin.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here today, and I'll be presenting a paper that's joint work with Brad Peterson, who is a partner at Chicago's Mayer Brown law firm, and the head of their manufacturing outsourcing and business process outsourcing divisions. So in our time together today, what I want to do is share with you the central finding of a study of contractual relations between large Midwestern integrated product manufacturers, that's firms like Harley-Davidson or John Deere, and their suppliers of component parts. What is the finding? Well, it's this. In this market, there is a near perfect convergence between, on the one hand, the 18 core management techniques of intra-firm hierarchy that the World Management Survey associates with increased productivity, and on the other hand, the long, detailed, and often overlooked sets of contract provisions, best characterized as managerial provisions for reasons that will become clear in a moment, that are included in modern procurement contracts. These managerial provisions, like most aspects of intra-firm hierarchy, are not in practice legally enforceable, at least not in what we think of as any meaningful sense. Yet, unlike the days in the 1960s, when Stuart Macaulay, the grandfather of relational contracts, studied this very market and found that contracts were put in the drawer never to be seen again, the managerial provisions in these agreements are understood by the parties as well as by their agents. They're fully integrated into the computer management platforms used to manage these relationships, and they have a very strong effect on the parties' workaday behavior under these agreements. One of the notable aspects of these provisions is that when they're all implemented together, they create value that's much greater than the sum of their parts. Why is this? Well, it's because in addition to increasing productivity, they provide a contract governance regime, a regime that is beautifully structured to facilitate the emergence and maintenance of commercial cooperation, to strengthen the force of network governance, and to scaffold the growth of the types of trust that the managerial literature associates with enhanced supplier performance. More broadly, the study reveals that the governance structures created by managerial provisions, together with the contract administration mechanisms that have been developed to implement them, have by now evolved to a point where buyers are able to functionally replicate through contract most, if not all, of the benefits that are associated with vertical integration. And they're able to do so without vertically integrating. Now, this raises interesting questions about the theory of the firm, and may also help explain Adelaide Horchescu and Severson's 2014 finding, reported in the American Economic Review, that the make or buy decision, at least as regards physical inputs, can explain only a fraction of the vertical ownership structure in the American economy, including in the manufacturing sector. Now, to understand just how closely the elements of intra-firm hierarchy and the terms of these inter-firm contract provisions converge, it's useful to take a little bit of a look at how each of the practices in the 4 World Management Survey categories that are pictured on the slide are reflected in the managerial terms of procurement contracts. So let's turn first to operations management. Procurement contracts typically require suppliers to adopt all the practices in this category. They require the suppliers to use lean manufacturing processes and particular types of quality control and work systems. These provisions are so important to buyers that they often send in their own consultants at no expense to the supplier to teach the supplier how to implement lean or meet quality control expectations. These teams don't just go in and out, but they can remain there for up to a year to ensure that the supplier does things up to the buyer's specifications. Now, going back to the provisions themselves, they also contain numerous other operations and quality controlled rules from micromanaging the supplier's operations. And sometimes it's sub-supplier's operations. And when I say micromanaging, I really do mean micromanaging. They'll often specify the exact source of raw materials, the exact placement of machines, requiring the supplier to seek special permission if they want to move any piece of equipment as little as 2 inches on the factory floor. They also dictate work instructions used on the faculty floor and specify large numbers of management provisions that the supplier must create. Now, things become even more detailed when it comes to the next categories of target setting and performance monitoring. Again, all the practices in the World Management Survey are required by contract. These agreements set out numerous key performance indicators. They describe how often they're to be calculated. The metrics are tracked on the online contract management systems used to administer these agreements. And the same data is visible to the buyer on the one hand and the supplier on the other on a daily basis. The contracts are also extraordinarily clear about specifying the precise consequences that a supplier will face if they fail to meet their obligations. And this is done by something known as the supplier scorecard process. Now, this sounds fancy, but it's really not a whole lot different from the report card that you or your kids got at school. This card aggregates information about the supplier's performance during a designated period of time. It'll have a category for attitude. Were you nice to the teacher? Were you cooperative? One for delivery, one for quality, all sorts of different things depending on the firm. It then assigns a weight to each category and a grade to each supplier. Get an A? Wonderful. You're going to get more business or more favorable business terms in the next quarter. Get a B? Things will stay the same, but they're going to watch you a little more carefully and sort of suggest that you up your game. Get a C? Well, if it's the first one, not clear what'll happen. But if it's not the first one, in all likelihood, the buyer is going to cut their buy and demand particular types of remedial action. Now, buyers also tend to reserve the right to use a wide variety of boots on the ground monitoring techniques. It's pretty clear when you look at these agreements that they rely more on monitoring and inspection than they're willing to rely on promises. These boots on the ground techniques range from audits to plant visits to, in some firms, having a buyer engineer present to help supervise aspects of the supplier's production line when that line is running for the buyer's account. The only area where there's the slightest bit of daylight, and here I just mean slightest bit, between the World Management Survey practices and the terms of these contracts comes in the area of talent management. But this doesn't diverge from a lack of desire to replicate these provisions, but rather from some arcane rules related to independent contractor status that give buyers a bit of pause, or at least give buyers' labor lawyers a bit of pause about putting too many controls on the supplier's workday employees on the line. But even with this constraint, the difference is slight. Among a great many other things, buyers dictate the key personnel in various parts of the supplier's hierarchy. They require employee exchanges. Buyer engineers will go work in the supplier's plant and the reverse. They specify quite directly the training that the supplier has to provide to people in various roles. Sometimes the buyer even comes in and provides the training themselves. And many firms now require the supplier to appoint one of the supplier's own employees, whose job it is to get to know what the buyer wants and then ensure that its own firm actually does that. So the buyer has a supplier employed agent within the supplier's firm to oversee things, report back, and ensure that it gets what it wants. So if we look at these together, we see that just like the hierarchical management techniques employed within a firm, these managerial provisions are designed to give the buyer the authority to monitor and manage important aspects of the supplier's operation, and to do so much as if they were operating as a single firm. Now, this is actually a good thing that this is possible, because there have been changes in these markets over the last 20 to 30 years, most notably the move towards supplier-led innovation and the adoption in America of Japanese-style quality control techniques that begin quite early, often in the design phase, that have really made it necessary for buyer employees on the one hand and supplier employees on the other, at numerous levels of both organizations, to work together, and to do so almost as if they were employed by a single entity, something that the governance techniques reflected in managerial contracts were designed to achieve. So with this description of managerial provisions on the table, what I want to do is take a step back and just briefly set out how, wholly apart from any productivity gains they might create, these provisions and the contract administration mechanisms that have been designed to implement them contribute to contract governance writ large. So let's start with cooperation and sketching out how these provisions help create the familiar conditions that can support the creation and maintenance of cooperative contracting relationships. So the first important precondition for cooperation to arise is that each party, in fact, begins the relationship by cooperating and expects its counterparty to do the same. Well, in procurement markets, this expectation is created by something called the Supplier Qualification process that takes place before a contract is even negotiated and signed. This process involves the exchange of reams of information from the supplier to the buyer. It involves the buyer visiting and inspecting and checking and kicking the tires of the supplier's plants. It involves reference checks, conversations with the supplier's employees. Together, these and other aspects of the process are very expensive for both the buyer and the supplier firms. So expensive, in fact, that neither of these firms would have a reason to go through the process unless they really expected and planned to begin their relationship with cooperation. As a consequence, each firm is pretty likely to enter into the relationship with a reasonable belief that the other is going to cooperate. Now, once cooperation is established, there are numerous other provisions and practices that are designed to reduce the likelihood that a relationship is going to break down over, one, a misunderstanding or lack of clarity over what's to be done, or two, an act of intended, genuinely heartfelt cooperation being mistakenly categorized as an act of defection, perhaps because of a particular outcome that occurred. So let's turn first to clarity. The managerial provisions in these contracts are very clear and very detailed. They often contain annotations explaining their meaning and extensive examples of how the firm intends to apply them. Yet firms have also developed a variety of other ways to ensure that suppliers understand what they're to do. A few examples. John Deere's website has numerous webinars on the meaning of the quality requirements it expects its suppliers to follow. Caterpillar University, which is run by the Caterpillar Corporation, covers subjects ranging from understanding Caterpillar's terms and conditions to how to do a weld that will make Caterpillar happy, or conduct business in a way that will comply with OSHA requirements. And as I mentioned earlier, buyers often just send their own personnel into suppliers' plants to make sure that the suppliers know what they have to do and can, in fact, do it. As for practices that reduce the likelihood that cooperation will unravel due to an act of cooperation being mischaracterized as an act of defection, one way this is avoided is through the inclusion of an important type of managerial provision known as a root cause provision. A root cause provision is a provision which requires the supplier to undertake a structured inquiry into the reason for bad outcomes and to share both the outcome of that investigation and the information uncovered during it with the buyer. This gives the buyer a way, maybe not a perfect way, but a decent way to determine and assess whether a particular bad outcome was a mistake or an act of defection, so that the buyer is less likely to misclassify an attempt at cooperation as an intended defection that will be responded to by a defection and thus lead to the unraveling of a contracting relationship. Now, to further guard against this possibility of bad outcomes leading to quick unraveling of a relationship, buyers go to great lengths to frame many of the most common things that go wrong in these contracts as problems to be solved, not defections or breaches. When a bad outcome occurs, they don't label it a breach. They don't call up the other side and scream, "You breached your contract." No. On the computer system, they send a polite email called a corrective action request that outlines the bad outcome, sort of suggests, "Oh, you must not have meant this. Could you fix it, please?" And as long as the supplier promptly solves the problem, you'll never hear the word breach used. That is, unless and until a real pattern of non-performance emerges. So taken together, these and other managerial provisions, some of which have the effect of extending the shadow of the future, have enabled these types of firms to enter into highly cooperative contracting relationships that really don't depend for their success on the shadow of the law. Now, I just have to switch slides here somehow for a moment. Let me see if I can do this. No, okay. All right, well, the next benefit that these provisions create is that they strengthen the force of something called network governance. If I had my slide up, what would you see? You'd see something like a ginormous spider web, where you see three big buyers in the middle of the spider web, and then all of these different little dots connected to one another. And what the slide shows is that big buyers tend to use the same suppliers, and that the suppliers in turn deal with one another. So they're connected by a dense and very clique-like level set of ties. Even if we just count supply relationships. And there are many other kinds of ties here that matter, from bowling leagues to church to other types of civic organizations. But when you have this dense set of connections, then the market functions like a small town, where the prospect of reputational harm for any kind of misbehavior is very high. Why? Because in this kind of closed network, gossip about misbehavior flies through the market, and it flies through the market incredibly fast, just as news flies among all sorts of people in your typical small town. Now, what does managerial contracting have to do with this? Well, the managerial provisions that are part of these contracts are not negotiated between buyer A and supplier A, and then again between buyer A and supplier B, Rather, they're standard across a buyer's suppliers, and they're posted on the web. So everyone knows what a John Deere supplier is supposed to do. So if gossip flows through the network, revealing what a John Deere supplier did, everyone else can quickly assess whether it was performance or not. A very different situation than when bespoke contracts are being used. So, given all of this, while the shadow of the law might not give much power to managerial provisions any more than it does to hierarchical mechanisms used within a firm, the shadow of multilateral reputational harm arising from information transfer in this dense network provides a very strong inducement for buyers and suppliers to comply with their obligations and behave reasonably to one another. Finally, it's interesting to note that the regularization of buyer-supplier interactions and the responses created by managerial provisions and contract administration mechanisms have really contributed to the creation of process-based trust, a type of trust that grows from the predictability of a partner's response. The management literature has shown that process-based trust is in turn correlated with the growth of interpersonal trust and interorganizational trust, both of which have been shown to be associated in empirical studies with enhanced supplier performance in various parts of the manufacturing sector. Now, with this view of the value creating potential and the governance creating potential of managerial contracts out on the table, I want to take a step back and conclude with a note of caution. And the note of caution is this: although the use or non-use within firms of the practices I shared with you today has been found to explain 30% of the productivity differences across firms, the question of why, if these sorts of practices are so valuable, they've not been adopted more widely, is a question that continues to bedevil management scholars. One prominent explanation for the failure of these practices to gain universal adoption is that the effectiveness of many of these managerial techniques is likely to turn on relational contracts within the firm, contracts that can't be changed overnight, and contracts that might be difficult to modify quickly. Given this, lawyers incorporating these managerial provisions into commercial contracts really have to pay attention to the fact that in order to understand the ways that the provisions are likely to affect workaday behavior in any given firm, they need to look not only at the terms of the contract between the parties, the traditional domain of transactional lawyering, but also at the organizational structure, network structure, and relational contracts within each of the contracting entities. The peril of failing to do so can best be shown by thinking briefly about Honda's early experience trying to move its US suppliers towards lean manufacturing, as it had its Japanese suppliers. Honda used numerous ways, its entire toolkit, to encourage its US suppliers to move to lean. Nothing worked. Why? Well, the reason turned out to be that the factory workers on the production line didn't trust management and feared that if the lean transformation was successful and productivity increased, they would be fired. That is, the relational contract within the US suppliers between management and workers was adversarial. So what did Honda's lawyers do? They then moved to include a no layoff provision in their supply contracts that prohibited suppliers from laying off workers when the lean transformation began to yield productivity benefits. And what do you know? Lean manufacturing began to flourish. So Honda's experience really does reveal, in quite stark terms, the importance of a firm's internal relational contracts to the way it's likely to respond to a contract provision. And this is something that has been documented in the managerial context in a number of different industries that has not yet become fully appreciated by transactional lawyers or legal academics of a law and economics variety who are focused on thinking hard about ways to create optimal contracts. So I will leave it here and open the floor to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was wonderful. Do you have any of the assistants who want to ask some questions? Maybe Cesar, our president.
No, thank you, Juan Martin. Thank you, Mrs. Lisa Bernstein, for your excellent presentation. And thank you so much for stay with us in this meeting, please. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. You know, I'd be interested in learning how this is done in your country, if anyone wants to share any practices with me. Pretty much every country has its own way, and it's really interesting to learn how things are done in different contexts.
Yeah, when you were, I mean, you were talking, you were saying how firms do relate each other in a way that could be similar to some sort of vertical integration. I was wondering, they keep all the managerial decisions separated, or they sort of take decisions that work together? I ask this question because we have this here in Argentina. I'm from Argentina. We have this provision in the employment. My field of expertise, to sort of, is employment law. So I want to ask you, because we have this provision in our contract, labor contract law, that it addresses mostly vicarious liability from this sort of agreements, you know. But what I wanted to know, if they keep the management separated, or do they take decisions as a whole, even though they are not one unit?
Well, first of all, they are very conscious not to do anything that would subject them to vicarious liability. That's part of what these independent contractor rules are about. So if it's going to do that, they absolutely don't do it. A lot of the contracts do provide for teams to make certain decisions. So they will set up some kind of joint development team that has buyer employees and supplier employees, or buyer engineers and supplier engineers, and encourage them to engage in joint decision-making over things like design characteristics. But when it comes to things like quality control and things of that sort, it does tend to be buyer dictated. And by that, I don't mean to suggest that this is necessarily bad, okay? Sometimes, you know, when one party seems to be exerting a lot of power, it's viewed in a very negative way. But what you have to realize is that a lot of these suppliers are much smaller than the buyers, and very often they experience managerial inertia. It's just really hard for them to change. People don't want to do it another way. So imagine you have a firm, and the entrepreneur comes in one day and says to the production workers, hey, guess what? You got to speed up the line, and I'm not going to pay you any more money. Well, that's not going to create a terribly good feeling within the firm. Now imagine that the person comes in the morning and says, hey, everyone, I've got fabulous news. We just landed a contract with John Deere. This is going to make our reputation excellent because everybody knows that you're a good plant if Deere buys from you. But guess what? Deere wants us to run the line faster. That's not going to lead to as much resistance, on the part of workers. They're going to think, okay, we'll get more stability. Something good is going to happen. So I've just begun to really look at this, okay? But it's very interesting as I start to do interviews to see suppliers describing how engagement with buyers help them solve problems, longstanding problems of managerial inertia. So that's one of the things I'm trying to look into as I move this project more into the field, looking at buyer-supplier relationships at particular companies. So yes, that's a very important aspect of the whole thing. You put your finger on it.
Okay, great, thank you. I was thinking about, we have this automotive firms here that produce cars, and they have this contracts with different suppliers. They have tire suppliers, they have seat suppliers, electrical system suppliers, window shield suppliers, and these small companies work almost exclusively for the we can call it the principal. The big firm. So I would think that's why I said integration in a certain way, because they work just they do the job just for, let's say, Ford, and it's all that they have. So it was that's what sort of rang my bell here.
Well, I've been really thinking about this too, because you really need to think. People always said, oh, fiat is great, it's cheaper than contract and all of this. So the really interesting question to me is, why is outsourcing now so much more preferred to internal production? And my intuition is that this somehow has something to do with this increased pace of innovation and the need for ever more narrow specialization, and the sense that large bureaucratic firms are not really where you're finding innovations. Like if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, you've seen that the biggest advances in R&D are really coming from the strategic alliances they enter into with biotech firms who are sort of more nimble, can try more things out, and things of that nature. So I guess I can't prove this in any meaningful sense, but my intuition and the direction of my research is trying to really think about how we might have to alter some traditional understandings of the theory of the firm in the context of a highly innovative economy, because firms need to be much more nimble. And my sense is that a lot of outsourcing is driven in part by firms' recognition that the person who makes the best carburetor today might not be the person who makes the best one tomorrow. And so what a car company wants is to be able to use one of the famous competition out clauses in the contract, which says, if someone comes along and can make it cheaper or can make it better, the buyer can terminate. And then whoop, you go off, you buy the better mousetrap, and you don't have to close divisions. You don't get a reputation for harming the local community. You just move on and everything's fine. So I think that has something to do with it, but I haven't yet worked out exactly how it all fits together.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions? I think we don't.
Well,
okay, great.
If anybody has questions they just don't feel like sharing publicly, or even more important, critiques or interesting examples, Ruben knows where to find me, and I'm always open to correspondence and interaction with people who've heard talks, because that tends to generate the most interesting examples that I never would have come across just sort of engaged in my own field research. So I want to thank you for this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to come to the institution, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. It was an honor. I think everyone feels the same, but they're kind of, in a way, I think that they are a bit embarrassed to talk. I don't know. I don't know why, but I think they might. Okay.
Well, no one needs to be embarrassed with me. As the introduction showed, I teach in many countries, and I cannot speak anything other than English, despite decades of trying. So I'm not one to criticize anyone's language, but if there aren't any more questions, again, thank you for this opportunity to share my ideas.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll see each other tomorrow at 7:30 a.m. and we will start again with this wonderful event. Thank you, Professor Bernstein, again.
Thank you.
And to all of us, of you, see you tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks again. I really, really appreciate it.
Nice meeting you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.